The dust of the Arizona Territory was a fine red powder that coated everything, a second skin for man and beast. It settled in the creases of Taza Naichi's eyes as he watched the town of Jericho Bend from a low mesa. The heat shimmered off the packed earth, making the distant cluster of wooden buildings tremble as if in a fever. Yucca plants, their spines sharp as needles, stood like silent sentinels across the arid plateau. Below him, his black horse, whose name was Shadow, shifted its weight, the muscles in its powerful shoulders bunching and releasing. An old burn scar, a patch of slick, hairless skin on its flank, was a permanent map of a pain they had both survived. Taza ran a hand over the horse's neck, his touch a silent promise. He lived by discipline and quiet, a necessity for an Apache man trying to earn a living guiding horses in a land that had grown to hate the sound of his native tongue. He was here to clear the name of his family, to wash away the lie that they had set fire to the railroad's grain stores, a lie that had cost them their home and their honor. In the telegraph office, the coolest building in Jericho Bend thanks to its thick adobe walls, Eleanor Hart, known to all as Nell, translated the frantic clicking of the incoming messages into words. The air inside smelled of ozone and dry paper. She had come from Boston almost a year ago, a widow at 26, seeking not adventure but oblivion from the crushing weight of grief. Her husband, a kind and ambitious railroad engineer, had been gone 2 years, his life lost in what the company called a tragic accident. Jericho Bend, with its stark, unforgiving beauty, was a world away from the manicured lawns and polite society she had left behind. Here, she was the telegraph operator, a vital but overlooked part of the town's machinery. And in her quiet moments, she was a freelance reporter, sending dispatches east about life on the frontier. But her most important work was secret. Tucked away in a locked drawer was a simple ledger book. Its pages were filled not with figures, but with her precise, elegant handwriting, documenting whispers and facts she gleaned from the telegraph wires and the loose talk of men who drank too much at the saloon. It was a record of injustice, a catalog of land deals that forced small ranchers and homesteaders off their property, always to the benefit of the expanding railroad. She noted names, dates, and sums of money. Many of the entries were coded, using railroad signal notations her late husband had taught her, a private language of loss and retribution. The entire project was a monument to him, a way to fight the same faceless power that had taken him from her. A single steel paperclip, embossed with the tiny letters SB Company, held a sheaf of her most recent notes together. SB Company, Silas Burke Company. Colonel Silas Burke was the architect of the railroad's relentless march, a man who bought influence as easily as he bought land, whose name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. He was the shadow stretching over the entire territory, and Nell's little book was the only light she could shine against it. Taza led his horse down the winding path from the mesa. He had a delivery to make, a string of 4 sturdy ponies for a rancher south of town. It was honest work. It kept him moving. It kept him from thinking too much about the whispers that followed him like his own shadow whenever he entered Jericho Bend. The children would stop their playing. The women would pull their shawls tighter. The men at the saloon would fall silent, their eyes hard and suspicious. The railroad's propaganda had been brutally effective. Apaches were raiders, burners, a menace to be stamped out so that progress could lay its iron tracks in peace. The town needed someone to blame for its hardships, for the dry wells and the failed crops, and his people were the convenient scapegoat. Nell finished her shift as the afternoon sun began its slow dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. She was a passenger on the weekly mail coach, heading to the neighboring settlement of Dusty Creek to deliver a package for the general store and, more importantly, to mail her latest article to a newspaper in St. Louis. She clutched her satchel tightly. The ledger was inside, wrapped in oilcloth. She knew carrying it was a risk, but leaving it in the office felt even more dangerous. She had to protect it. It was the only weapon she had. The coach, a rickety wooden box pulled by 2 tired horses, rattled out of town. The driver, a grizzled man named Jed, chewed on a piece of straw and offered occasional comments on the weather. Nell was the only passenger. The landscape rolled by, a monotonous and beautiful expanse of red rock and hardy scrub. The rhythm of the wheels was hypnotic, and she found her thoughts drifting back to Boston, to the feel of her husband's hand in hers. A sudden, violent lurch threw her from the seat. Jed yelled a curse. The coach skidded to a halt in a cloud of its own dust. Through the window, Nell saw a man on horseback blocking the path. He was tall and lean, with a long coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He held a revolver, and it was pointed directly at Jed. Another man, this one on foot, emerged from behind a cluster of rocks, holding a rifle. Jed raised his hand slowly. "Do what he says." "Miss Hart," he mumbled, his voice tight with fear. The man on horseback dismounted. His name was Vance Crowe, and he moved with the cold efficiency of a predator. His eyes, when he glanced toward the coach, were devoid of emotion. He was not a common highwayman. This was a professional. He ignored Jed's mailbags. He walked straight to the coach door and pulled it open. "I am looking for a book," he said, his voice a low, gravelly tone. "A ledger. I believe you have it." Nell's blood ran cold. How could he possibly know her heart hammered against her ribs? She stared at the barrel of the gun he now aimed at her chest. "I do not know what you are talking about," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. Vance Crowe sighed, a sound of mild annoyance. He raised the gun. "It is a shame. I was instructed to avoid unnecessary complications." From his position on the trail, Taza had seen the whole thing unfold. He had been tracking a mountain cat that had been preying on local livestock, a small job to earn a little extra money. He was hidden by a shallow arroyo, the whisper of the wind covering any sound he made. He recognized Vance Crowe. Crowe was a bounty hunter, a man who worked for the highest bidder, and his current employer was known to be Colonel Burke. Taza had no love for the settlers, but he had a deep hatred for men like Crowe and the injustice they served, and he saw the terror on the woman's face, a terror that went beyond a simple robbery. This was an execution in the making. Discipline took over. He moved without a thought, a silent wraith flowing over the sandy ground. He circled around, coming up behind the second man, the one holding the rifle. A single, swift blow with a rock, and the man crumpled to the ground without a sound. Crowe heard the faint thud and turned, his instinct screaming. He saw Taza rising from the dust, a knife in his hand. For a split second, Crowe was caught between two targets, the woman in the coach and the Apache warrior advancing on him. He made his choice. He swung his gun toward Taza. It was the opening Taza needed. He lunged, not at Crowe, but at the horses. With a sharp cut of his knife, he severed the traces connecting the team to the coach. He slapped their rumps hard, shouting a sharp command in his own language. The horses, panicked and free, bolted down the road. Crowe fired his pistol, but the shot went wide, lost in the chaos. Taza grabbed Nell's arm. "Come," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." He pulled her from the coach and half-dragged her toward the arroyo. Nell stumbled, her mind reeling. She could hear Crowe shouting in frustration behind them. Another gunshot echoed through the still air. At that moment, the world changed. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, suddenly became a howling gale. The sky, clear moments before, turned a muddy brown. A wall of sand and dust rose from the desert floor, a monstrous, churning wave that swallowed the light and the landscape. A sandstorm. It had come upon them with the suddenness of an ambush. Taza did not hesitate. He pushed Nell down into the relative shelter of the dry creek bed, shielding her with his body as the first blast of stinging sand hit them. He pulled the kerchief from his neck and pressed it into her hand. "Cover your face," he commanded, his voice muffled by the roaring wind. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of stinging grit and suffocating darkness. Nell could see nothing, hear nothing but the scream of the wind. She felt the solid weight of the man beside her, a strange and unexpected anchor in the chaos. She had been saved from a man's gun only to be thrown into the teeth of nature's fury. The man was an Apache, one of the people everyone in Jericho Bend feared and reviled. He had appeared from nowhere, a silent specter of the desert, and he had just saved her life. She held the ledger in its satchel close to her body, a secret that had almost cost her everything, and pressed the rough cloth of the kerchief to her mouth and nose, breathing in the faint, clean scent of sage and leather. She was alive, for now, lost in a storm with a silent stranger, a man whose people were blamed for every misfortune, but who had chosen, for reasons she could not fathom, to rescue her. The truth, she was beginning to understand, had a very high price, and she was only just beginning to pay it. The world returned slowly, the roar of the wind diminishing to a mournful whisper. A fine layer of red dust covered them like a shroud. Taza pushed himself up, his movements fluid and economical. The air was thick and tasted of grit. The landscape, once familiar, was now alien, its contours softened and reshaped by the storm. He looked at the woman beside him. She was pushing herself to her knees, coughing, her face pale beneath the coating of dust. Her eyes, wide and startled, met his. There was fear in them, but also a stubborn flicker of resilience he had not expected. He retrieved his kerchief from her hand. The water from his canteen was precious, but he poured a small amount onto the cloth. He wiped the grime from his own face, then handed the damp cloth to her. She took it without a word, her gratitude a silent thing in the immense stillness that followed the storm. The mail coach was gone, likely buried or overturned somewhere in the brown haze. Vance Crowe and his man were also gone. For the moment, they were alone. "We cannot stay here," Taza said. His voice was rough from the dust. He scanned the horizon. The sun was a hazy, indistinct circle in the sky. To the west, the land broke into a series of jagged mesas and deep, dry washes. It was difficult country, but it offered cover. To the east lay the open trail, a clear path for anyone following them. The choice was not a choice at all. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice raspy. She had a satchel clutched in her hand as if it were a life raft. "To a place where we will not be found," he answered. He offered her his hand. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. Her hand was small, but her grip was firm. He pulled her to her feet. He had his knife and his canteen. The woman had her satchel. It was not much to face the desert with. His horse, Shadow, was gone, along with the ponies he was delivering. A deep pang of loss and anger went through him. The horse was more than an animal. It was his partner, a living link to the life that had been stolen from him. This complication, this woman and her secrets, had cost him dearly. They walked in silence for the first hour, Taza setting a hard, steady pace. He moved with a purpose that was both comforting and intimidating, his eyes constantly reading the terrain, choosing the path that left the faintest sign. The sun burned through the haze, and the heat became a physical presence, pressing down on them. Nell felt her city-bred lungs laboring. Her fine leather shoes were not made for this kind of travel, but she did not complain. She understood, with a primal clarity, that her survival depended entirely on the silent man leading her through this desolate wilderness. She also understood that she had brought this trouble upon him. The thought was a leaden weight in her stomach. As they paused in the shade of a rock outcropping, she watched him check the leather straps on his moccasins. She noticed a small tear in the flap of his saddlebag, likely from the frantic escape. Without thinking, she opened her satchel. Tucked inside, beside the precious ledger, was a small sewing kit, a relic of her former life. She pulled out a sturdy needle and a spool of waxed thread. "Let me," she said, her voice quiet. Taza looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He saw the needle and thread, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He wordlessly handed her the damaged leather. She sat, her back against the warm rock, and began to stitch the tear with small, neat stitches. It was a simple act, but in the vast, empty space around them, it felt significant. She was not helpless. She had a skill, however small, that was useful. When she finished, the repair was barely visible. She handed the bag back to him. He examined her work, his thumb running over the tight stitches. He gave a single, curt nod. It was not praise, but it was an acknowledgement. A tiny seed of trust had been planted in the barren ground of their enforced companionship. They walked on. The day burned away into a cold, clear night. The sky was a velvet blanket studded with a breathtaking number of stars. The cold was as bitter as the day's heat had been oppressive. Taza found them shelter in a shallow cave, its mouth screened by a tangle of hardy brush. He did not build a fire. A fire could be seen for miles. They ate nothing. They had nothing to eat. He offered her the canteen. She drank, then handed it back. "You drink," she insisted. "You have had none all day." He took a small swallow, his eyes never leaving the darkness beyond their shelter. This sharing of the water became their first ritual, a silent contract. We are in this together. We will survive or we will fail together. Nell lay huddled in the darkness, her thoughts a whirlwind, her carefully constructed article, her secret investigation. It had all exploded into this desperate flight for her life. She feared that by trying to expose the injustices against others, she would only bring them more harm. She thought of the ranching families mentioned in her ledger, their names and locations now a dangerous liability. What if Crow found the book he would not just stop with her? The thought made her feel physically ill. Taza sat sentinel at the mouth of the cave, a motionless silhouette against the stars. He was thinking of the tracks they were leaving. He was skilled, one of the best. But Vance Crow was not a fool. He knew this land too. Every step Taza took was a calculated risk, a gamble that his path would be too difficult, too clever for his pursuer. But any trail, no matter how faint, could lead back, not just to him, but to the hidden encampment where the remnants of his family lived in quiet dignity, hoping the world would forget they existed. He had brought this danger to their doorstep by interfering. Honor had demanded it, but the cost could be unthinkable. The next day was a blur of sun and rock. Thirst was a constant companion. They spoke little, conserving their energy. Late in the afternoon, Taza held up a hand. Stopping her, he pointed. Below them, in a shallow canyon, was a flicker of movement. It was not the natural movement of an animal. It was a man, and he was crawling. They made their way down the treacherous slope. The man was Chinese, one of the thousands brought over to build the railroad, his thin clothes in tatters. His face was a swollen mass of bruises, and one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle. He looked up at them with eyes clouded with pain and fear. When he saw Taza, he flinched, expecting a final, fatal blow. "Water," Nell said softly to Taza. He passed her the canteen without hesitation. She knelt beside the injured man and gently lifted his head, letting him sip the precious liquid. He drank greedily, then coughed, his body racked with pain. He spoke in broken, halting English. "They beat me, left me to die. Said I saw too much." "What did you see?" Nell asked gently. The man's name was Li Wei. He had been a foreman's assistant, privy to conversations he was not meant to understand. He had seen Colonel Burke himself paying a large sum of money to the man who had been Jericho Bend's sheriff before the current one. It was a payoff. Hush money. The old sheriff had been the one to sign off on the official reports blaming the Apaches for fires and raids that Li Wei knew had been set by Burke's own men. "Burke bought him," Li Wei whispered, his voice cracking. "Bought the law." He looked at Taza, a new understanding in his eyes. "Not you. It was never you." Taza's face was a mask of stone, but his hands were clenched into tight fists. It was the confirmation of what he had always known. a truth that had been buried under a mountain of lies. "We need to get you to a doctor," Nell said. "No," Li Wei shook his head. "They watch the towns. They will find me, find you. There is a place, a ranch, the Ortega Ranch. The new sheriff, Miguel Ortega. He is a good man. His wife, Maria, she is kind. They help people. They will not turn you away." Taza knew of Sheriff Ortega. He was a Mexican-American, a man who walked a difficult line. Distrusted by some of the white settlers but respected for his fairness, he was their only chance. The ranch was 2 days' hard journey to the southwest. It was a desperate gamble, but it was better than dying in the desert. "We will take you," Taza said. It was not a question. He tore strips from his own shirt to fashion a crude splint for Li Wei's leg. Then, with a strength that astonished Nell, he lifted the injured man onto his back. The added weight would slow them down, make their trail easier to follow. It was a terrible risk, but leaving the man to die was not an option. Not for him, and not for her. As they set off again, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them, Nell felt a profound shift inside her. Her mission was no longer an abstract quest for journalistic justice. It had a face, swollen and bruised, and a name. Li Wei. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. She had to get the ledger to safety. She had to get its story out. She would find a way to contact her editors, perhaps from the Ortega's ranch. She would not let men like Burke and Crow win. Taza moved forward, his steps measured and sure. Even with the burden he carried, he was no longer just a guide. He was a protector. He had taken on the responsibility of not one life, but 2. He was leading them toward a sanctuary that might not be safe, pursued by a man who would not stop. The desert was their enemy, the sun their tormentor, and the silence was filled with the unspoken fears that bound the 3 of them together. The shared canteen, now perilously light, was passed between them, a fragile symbol of their reluctant, desperate alliance. They stumbled out of the wilderness at dawn. 3 ghosts coated in the dust of the earth. The Ortega Ranch appeared first as a dark line on the horizon, then as a cluster of low, solid adobe buildings, a haven in the unforgiving landscape. A dog began to bark, a frantic, high-pitched sound that was the most welcome thing Nell had ever heard. Taza shifted the weight of Li Wei on his back, his face a stoic mask that could not quite hide his exhaustion. A man emerged from the largest building, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He was of medium height, with a sun-weathered face and a thick, dark mustache. His eyes were sharp and intelligent. This was Sheriff Miguel Ortega. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, the Apache warrior carrying an injured Chinese man, and the disheveled, weary white woman at his side. He did not raise his rifle. A woman appeared behind him, wiping her hands on an apron. Maria Ortega was a woman whose warmth was a palpable force. She saw not threats, but suffering. "Madre de Dios," she whispered, hurrying forward. "Bring him inside. Quickly!" There were no questions asked, no demands for explanation. Taza carried Li Wei into the cool, dim interior of the house, which smelled of coffee and baking bread, and laid him gently on a cot that Maria had directed him to. Maria immediately set to work, her hands deft and sure as she cut away the ruined trouser leg and examined Li Wei's injury. She sent Miguel for hot water and clean bandages. Nell sank into a wooden chair at the kitchen table, the satchel with her ledger resting in her lap. The simple, domestic scene, the feeling of solid walls around her, was so overwhelming that she felt tears welling in her eyes. Maria, noticing her state, placed a tin mug of steaming coffee in front of her. "Drink," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You are safe now." Later. After Li Wei had been made comfortable and Nell had washed the layers of dust from her face and hands, they sat with Miguel at the table. Taza stood by the doorway, a silent guardian, refusing offers of a chair. He watched and he listened, his presence a constant reminder of the world outside these peaceful walls. Nell, her voice low and steady, recounted the events of the past 2 days, from the ambush of the mail coach to their discovery of Li Wei. She explained the significance of her ledger, the coded entries that detailed the systematic theft of land and resources by Colonel Burke's railroad company. Miguel listened intently, his fingers steepled before him. He nodded slowly as she spoke. He was a man who understood the subtle currents of power in the territory. "This is not surprising," he said when she had finished. "Burke has been buying more than land. He has been buying silence. Many small ranchers have sold out to him, claiming they were tired of fighting the drought and the Apache raids." He stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "It is always the Apaches who are blamed. It quiets the questions of the townsfolk." He looked at Taza. "They say you led the raid on the grain store last spring." Taza met his gaze without flinching. "A lie," he said. 2 words that carried the weight of a lifetime of injustice. Miguel nodded again. "I believe you." He had seen too much, heard too many convenient stories, to trust the official narrative. He ran a hand through his dark hair. "The problem is proof. Your book, Miss Hart, is a start. But it is your word against a man who can buy and sell the territorial governor." Maria's kitchen became their sanctuary and their war room. Word of their arrival spread not through official channels, but through the quiet, efficient network she maintained. A vaquero stopping for water, a priest visiting from the next town, a family on their way to market. All carried pieces of news. They learned that Vance Crowe had returned to Jericho Bend, empty-handed and furious. They learned that the official story was that the mail coach had been attacked by a band of savage Apaches, led by Taza Naiche, who had also abducted the telegraph operator. This network also brought them clues. An old rancher, visiting with Maria, spoke of how his access to a vital creek had been cut off by a new railroad fence, forcing him to sell his land to Burke for a pittance. Another told a story of seeing surveyors far from the planned railroad route, deep in the hills near a place the Apache called Hidden Spring. Nell spread the pages of her ledger on the table, and with Miguel's help, a pattern began to emerge. The names of the ranchers who had been forced out, the dates of the suspicious fires, the locations of the land grabs. They all pointed to one thing. "Water," Nell said, her finger tracing a line on a hand-drawn map Miguel had provided. "He is not just taking land. He is taking the water." "He who controls the water controls everything," Miguel agreed, his expression grim. "And the biggest source of clean water in these parts is Hidden Spring, which is on land that is supposed to be protected in Day territory." Their investigation was interrupted by the thunder of approaching horses. A small group of men from Jericho Bend, their faces flushed with whiskey and self-righteousness, rode into the ranch yard. They were not an official posse, just a mob of angry citizens, led by a store owner whose brother worked for the railroad. "Ortega," the man shouted. "We know you have him. Send out the Apache murderer." Miguel stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Taza moved back from the doorway, deeper into the shadows of the house. Nell's heart pounded. "You are on my property." "Zebulon," Miguel said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "And you are disturbing the peace. Take your men and go home." "We want the Apache," another man slurred. "He is wanted for murder and kidnapping. We will have justice." Miguel stood his ground. "I am the law in this county. Justice is my business, not yours. If you have a warrant, you can serve it. If not, you are trespassing. Now leave, before I'm forced to arrest you for inciting a riot." The men grumbled, their drunken courage failing in the face of the sheriff's unyielding authority. They exchanged uncertain glances, then slowly turned their horses and rode away, their shouts fading into the afternoon heat. Miguel came back inside, his face set in hard lines. "That is just the beginning," he said. Burke will not stop. He will use the town's fear to do his work for him. A few days later, a traveling postwriter brought a letter for Nell. It was from the editor of the St. Louis newspaper she had been writing for. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The words were polite but firm. Her articles were well written, but they were inflammatory and based on unsubstantiated rumors. Without a reliable, named source, they could not risk publishing her accusations against a man as powerful as Colonel Burke. It was a rejection, a complete dismissal of her work, of her truth. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had risked everything, and for what? To be told her words were worthless. She walked out of the house, needing to be alone. She found her way to a small, sun-baked chapel at the edge of the ranch yard. A simple iron cross, once mounted on the roof, lay on the ground beside the door. Its base having rusted through, it was bent and broken, but it was still a cross. It was a symbol of a faith that had been damaged but not destroyed. She sat on the steps, the letter crumpled in her hand, and looked out at the vast, indifferent landscape. The editor in his comfortable office in St. Louis did not know this land. He did not know the faces of the people Burke was crushing, but she did. She had seen Lee Wei's battered body. She had seen the unwavering resolve in Miguel's eyes. She had seen the quiet dignity in Taza's silence. She would not be silenced by a man who had never set foot in the dust of the territory. She smoothed out the letter and tore it into small pieces, letting the wind carry them away. Her source would be herself. That evening, as Maria was preparing the evening meal, she watched Taza, who was watching Nell as she copied the entries from her ledger into a new book, creating a duplicate for safekeeping. He was trying to be subtle, but his gaze lingered on the way the lamplight caught the strands of her hair. "You look at her like you are trying to memorize a star chart," Maria said, her voice laced with gentle amusement. Taza started, his composure broken for a fraction of a second. "I am watching for danger," he said, his tone brusque. Maria just smiled. "Of course you are." The next night, Taza and Miguel rode out under the cover of darkness. Based on the information they had gathered, they knew Burke had to have detailed plans of his real intentions. A railroad company ran on maps and paperwork, and the most likely place to find them was the main SB Company warehouse near the Jericho Bend station. They moved like shadows, leaving their horses a mile away and approaching the warehouse on foot. The building was dark and silent. Miguel, using a thin piece of metal, worked the lock on a side door. It clicked open with a faint metallic sound. They slipped inside. The warehouse smelled of oil, coal dust, and raw lumber. Crates were stacked high in the gloom. In a small, cramped office at the back, they found what they were looking for. In a locked metal box, they discovered not just shipping manifests, but a rolled-up surveyor's map. Taza unrolled it carefully on the desk. It was a revised route for the railroad, and it was exactly as they had feared. The new line deviated sharply from the public plans, cutting directly across the Ende lands, a red line that ran straight through the heart of the valley that held Hidden Spring. It was the proof they needed, the undeniable evidence of Burke's entire scheme. They had just rolled up the map when they heard the sound of a key in the main door lock. They froze. They had only seconds. Miguel pointed to a high window at the back of the office. Taza needed no other signal. He tucked the map inside his shirt and in a single, powerful movement, vaulted onto the desk and through the open window, landing silently on the ground outside. Miguel followed a moment later, just as the main door creaked open and a lantern beam cut through the darkness. They ran, not stopping until they reached their horses, their hearts pounding with adrenaline. They had the proof, but as they rode back to the ranch, they both knew that possessing the truth and being able to use it were two very different things. Their victory was short-lived. The next day, the priest who rode a weekly circuit brought them the news. A new poster had been plastered all over Jericho Bend and the surrounding towns. It offered a substantial reward, issued by the railroad company, for the capture of Taza Naichi, the Apache fugitive. And right next to his name was a second one, with an equally high price on her head. Eleanor Hart, the rebellious telegraph operator. The reward poster, tacked to the wall of the Ortega kitchen, was a stark proclamation of their new reality. The crude drawings of Taza and Nell looked nothing like them. Yet the names and the sums of money were terrifyingly real. They were no longer just fugitives. They were valuable commodities. Wanted dead or alive. The air in the room was thick with unspoken fear and the weight of impossible choices. "We cannot stay here," Miguel said, stating the obvious. "To stay is to bring war to your doorstep. The mob that came before was just a taste. Burke will send professionals next." "Then we must move," Nell said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We have the map. We have my ledger. We have Lee Wei's testimony. We have the pieces. We just need to put them before the right person." "A circuit judge is in Tucson," Miguel mused. "But Tucson is a week's ride, and every bounty hunter in the territory will be looking for you on the main roads." A new plan was needed, one that was bold and desperate. It formed in the quiet spaces between their words, a strategy born of their combined strengths. "I can get a message out," Nell said. "There is a small telegraph repeater station about 30 miles south of here, connected to a private railroad line. It is rarely used. If you can get me there." "Miguel, I can send a coded version of my ledger's contents to an old colleague in San Francisco, someone I trust completely. It is a risk, but it means the information will not die with me if I am caught." "It is a good risk," Miguel agreed. "And what of you, Taza?" Taza had been studying the stolen map. His finger traced the red line that desecrated the lands of his people. "Hidden Spring." He said, his voice low, "Burke's plan cannot succeed without it. I will go there. I will see what his men are doing. The Ende must be warned." "That is sacred land," Miguel said with a frown. "Even I would have trouble getting through there without starting a conflict." "I will not go alone," Taza replied. "I will find old Ada. She is a woman of medicine and wisdom. She is respected by all the clans. She will know a safe path. She will understand the danger." And so the plan was set, a two-front war against an enemy of immense power. The next morning, before the sun had crested the mountains, Miguel and Nell rode south, their faces grim. Maria pressed a small bag of food into Nell's hands, her eyes saying everything her words could not. "Stay safe, be strong, come back." Taza watched them go, then turned his attention north, toward the jagged peaks where old Ada made her home. He and Nell had agreed to meet at a prearranged location, a hidden shepherd's camp, in 5 days. He traveled light and fast, his senses alive to the land, every rustle of a bush, every distant bird call a piece of information. The meeting with old Ada was not easy. She was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes as sharp and clear as a hawk's. She listened to his story in the smoky dimness of her wickiup, her gnarled hands never still as she ground herbs with a stone pestle. "The railroad is a serpent of iron," she said when he had finished. "It poisons the water and steals the breath of the land. Your fight is our fight, but you bring a white woman with you. She brings the white man's trouble. She understands." Taza insisted. Her heart is true. Old Ada looked at him for a long, searching moment. Then she gave a slow nod. "I will give you a guide. My grandson, Kavi. He knows a path through the valley that even the coyotes do not use. But be warned, the sky is angry. The summer rains are coming." 2 days later, Taza met Nell at the shepherd's camp. She was tired but triumphant. "The message is sent," she told him. "The story is safe. Now we prove it." Kavi, a quiet, watchful boy of 16, led them into the high country. The trail was treacherous, a barely visible track that wound its way through a deep, narrow canyon. The walls of red rock rose hundreds of feet on either side, so close in places that they could touch both sides at once. The air was still and cool. They had been in the canyon for half a day when the world changed. The sky, visible only as a narrow ribbon of blue far above, darkened with an unnatural speed. A low rumble, like distant thunder, vibrated through the stone beneath their feet. Taza grabbed Nell's arm, his eyes scanning the canyon walls. "The flood," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "We must climb, now!" The rumble grew to a roar. Kavi, 50 yards ahead, had already started scrambling up a steep fissure in the rock face. Taza shoved Nell toward it. "Go! Do not look back!" She did not need to be told twice. She clawed her way up the rough stone, her fingers finding small, sharp handholds. Taza was right behind her. They were perhaps 30 feet above the canyon floor when the water hit. It was not a river. It was a solid wall of churning brown water, filled with rocks and uprooted trees, that exploded into the canyon with the force of a cannon blast. The sound was deafening, a primal scream of nature's rage. It filled the canyon in seconds, the violent current tearing at the very rock they clung to. Nell looked down and saw the place where they had stood moments before, submerged under a raging torrent. She looked for Kavi, but he was gone. The path ahead, the path back, everything was gone. They were trapped, alone, on a narrow ledge, with the floodwaters roaring below. They waited for hours, the water slowly receding, leaving behind a thick layer of mud and debris. The canyon was impassable. They had to find another way. They were forced to climb higher, seeking a route over the top of the mesa. It was slow, dangerous work. They were exposed, their trail now a clear set of tracks in the damp earth for anyone to see. And someone did see. As they reached the windswept top of the mesa, Taza stopped, his body going tense. He pulled Nell behind a cluster of boulders. Far below, on the plain they had just crossed, was a lone rider, a man in a long coat, his hat pulled low. Vance Crow. He had found them. The chase was grim and silent. Taza used every bit of his skill to try and lose him, but Crow was relentless. A predator who knew his prey was trapped. The pursuit led them across the high, flat mesa until they reached its edge. Before them was a sheer drop. To their left, a narrow, crumbling land bridge of rock, barely wide enough for one person, connected their mesa to the next. It was their only way forward. They were halfway across when Crow appeared at the other end. He had circled around, anticipating their move. He held a pistol in his hand, a grim smile on his face. "Nowhere left to run," he said. "Give me the woman and the book. Apache, and I might let you live." "Go," Taza said to Nell, pushing her gently forward. "Get to the other side." He turned to face Crow. He had only his knife. Crow had a gun, but on the narrow, unstable bridge of rock, a gun was a clumsy weapon. Taza advanced slowly, his body balanced, his eyes locked on Crow's. Crow fired. Taza dropped flat, the bullet whining past his head, and lunged forward, sweeping his leg out and knocking Crow's feet from under him. The bounty hunter fell hard, the pistol flying from his grasp and skittering over the edge into the chasm below. The two men rose, circling each other on the precarious perch. The fight was brutal and primitive. It was not about skill. It was about survival. They exchanged blows, the sound of their grunts and the thud of fist on flesh unnaturally loud in the silence of the high desert. Crow was bigger and stronger, but Taza was faster, more agile. He dodged a wild swing and drove his shoulder into Crow's midsection. The bounty hunter staggered back, his boot heels crumbling the very edge of the precipice. For a terrifying moment, he teetered on the brink, his arms windmilling for balance. Taza lunged forward, not to push, but to grab the front of Crow's coat. He pulled with all his strength, dragging the heavier man back to solid ground. Crow fell to his knees, gasping for air, staring at Taza with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Taza stood over him, his knife in his hand, his chest heaving. Nell watched from the far side of the bridge, her hand over her mouth, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw a flicker of something in Crow's eyes, a look that was not just fear, but a strange, bitter recognition. "I know you did not burn that grain store." "Naichi," Crow rasped, his voice raw. "I was a scout commander back then. I saw the real tracks. It was Burke's men." "Then why?" Taza asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Because he offered me a clean slate," Crow admitted, shame and defiance warring in his expression. "He holds my past over my head. It was you or me." Taza looked down at the man, then at the knife in his hand. He could end it. He could silence this man forever, remove the threat. But he saw not a monster, but a man trapped in his own cage of past mistakes. Taza sheathed his knife. "Justice is not served by a silent grave," he said, his voice clear and steady. He turned and walked away, leaving Crow on his knees. That night, they found shelter in a shallow cave. The fire they built was small, more for comfort than for warmth. The violence of the day had stripped away their defenses, leaving them both raw and vulnerable. "My husband, Thomas," Nell said softly, staring into the flames. "He was an engineer for the railroad. He died 2 years ago. They said it was an accident, a boiler explosion, but it was not as..." Taza looked at her, his silence an invitation to continue. "He found something," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "An error in the accounting, a discrepancy that pointed to bribery, to materials being sold off, to shortcuts being taken on safety. He was going to report it. He told me about it the night before he left on his last run. His train never came back. Burke's network, his web of corruption. It killed him. This started as my way of finding justice for Thomas. But it has become something more." Taza understood. His fight was for his family's honor. Hers was for her husband's memory. But they had both converged on the same truth. It was a fight for the land itself, for the people, for the very idea that justice should not be a thing that could be bought or sold. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later when they finally made their way down from the mesas. A young boy from the Ortega Ranch found them. He carried a message from Maria. A territorial marshal, a man known to be in Burke's pocket, had arrived at the ranch. He had formally suspended Miguel from his duties as sheriff, pending an investigation into his aiding of known fugitives. Maria was now alone, surrounded by neighbors who were growing more hostile by the day. The price for their fight was being paid by their friends, and the stakes had just become impossibly high. The news of Miguel's suspension was a physical blow, a confirmation that Burke's reach extended into the very heart of the law. There was no more hiding. The Ortega Ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. Taza and Nell knew what they had to do. They could not leave their friends to face the consequences of a fight they had started. To run now would be a cowardice worse than any capture. They had to go back, not to the ranch, which would be watched, but to the outskirts of Jericho Bend itself. They would find a way to help Miguel and Maria. Their return was a journey into the lion's den. They moved only at night, using the shadows of the mesas and arroyos that Taza knew as well as the lines on his own hand. They found a temporary hiding place in an abandoned line shack a few miles from town, a forgotten relic of some failed homesteading attempt. From there, they could watch the road, trying to understand the new landscape of their war. But Colonel Burke was a master strategist, and he was 2 steps ahead of them. He knew that simply putting a price on their heads was not enough. He needed to turn the simmering pot of public opinion into a boiling rage. He needed an event, an atrocity so undeniable that it would unite the entire town against the Apache and anyone foolish enough to side with them. The fire at the San Pedro Gulch Supply Depot was his masterstroke. It was a secondary warehouse, but it held winter provisions for many of the smaller ranches in the area. The fire started late at night, a bloom of orange against the dark hills that could be seen for miles. By morning, it was a smoldering ruin, and planted neatly in the mud nearby, where it was sure to be found, was a single, carefully crafted arrow. It was not a common hunting arrow. It was made in the old style, with hawk feathers and a distinctive flint head, a type of arrow that a white man's imagination would immediately associate with an Apache warrior. It was a piece of theater, and it was devastatingly effective. By the time Taza and Nell heard the news from a traveling peddler, the story had already taken on a life of its own. It was not just a fire. It was a massacre of supplies, an act of war against the innocent people of the territory, and Taza Naichi was its leader. "He has to be stopped," the peddler said, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "They say he is gathering the clans for a full-scale raid. Sheriff Ortega was a fool to ever trust him." Taza's face was like carved granite. It was the same lie that had destroyed his family, now wielded again to destroy his friends and turn an entire population into a lynch mob. He had to act. He planned to slip into town under the cover of the next night, to get a message to Miguel, to warn him. It was a desperate, reckless plan, born of a righteous anger that burned hotter than the warehouse fire. The trap was laid with chilling precision. As Taza moved through the darkened alleys on the edge of town, the shadows themselves seemed to come alive. He was not met with a single lawman, but with a dozen of Burke's hired guns, appearing from doorways and rooftops. He fought with a silent, desperate fury, a whirlwind of motion against the closing circle. But the numbers were too great. A heavy blow from a rifle butt caught him on the side of the head, and the world exploded into a shower of stars before fading to black. When he awoke, it was to the jeers of a crowd and the harsh bite of ropes on his wrists. He was in the middle of Jericho Bend's main street, tied securely to a thick wooden hitching post. The morning sun was hot on his face. The entire town, it seemed, had turned out to see the captured devil. Their faces were a sea of contorted hatred. "String him up!" a man yelled, and the cry was taken up by the crowd. "Hang the savage!" A rope with a crudely tied noose appeared, thrown over the crossbeam of a nearby awning. The raw, undisciplined prejudice that Burke had so carefully nurtured had now been unleashed. There would be no trial, no justice, only the swift, brutal satisfaction of the mob. Nell watched from the window of a deserted tack room above the livery stable, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. She had followed Taza against his wishes, sensing the danger, and had been helpless to do anything but watch him being taken down. Now she was a witness to a public execution in the making. Panic clawed at her, a dizzying, helpless terror. But then, through the fear, a cold, sharp clarity emerged. She was not a helpless woman. She was a telegraph operator. She understood the secret language of the wires, the nervous system that connected this entire territory, and she could use it. She found Li Wei hiding in the cellar of the town's small laundry, where he had been given shelter by the elderly owner. His leg was healing, but he was still weak. She explained her plan, her words coming in a low, urgent rush. "It is insane," he said, his eyes wide. "It is our only chance," she replied. "Will you help me?" He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and gave a slow nod. He owed them his life. It was a debt he intended to repay. Nell made her way to the back of the telegraph office. The regular operator was out in the street, caught up in the bloodlust of the crowd. She slipped inside, the familiar smell of the equipment a strange comfort. Her fingers flew across the telegraph key, the clicks and clacks sounding unnaturally loud in the empty room. She was not sending a message in plain language. She was using the railroad's own coded protocols, a complex language of signals she had learned from her husband. She composed a fake message, an emergency directive from the territorial headquarters. It reported a bridge washout on the main line 50 miles to the east, a catastrophic failure that threatened the company's most important route. All available railroad security personnel were to be dispatched immediately to secure the area. It was an order that would take precedence over all other duties, an order that would pull Burke's men out of town. She directed it to the local railroad office, knowing the station master was a man who followed orders without question. As she sent the last character, she heard a commotion outside. Her message had been received. She saw the station master run out, waving the transcription, shouting at the leader of Burke's men. There was a brief, angry argument, but the authority of the telegraph wire was absolute, cursing. The railroad men mounted their horses and galloped out of town. Now, she whispered to herself. It was Li Wei's signal. From his position behind the office, he took a heavy iron bar and with all his strength smashed the main electrical insulator connecting the town's line to the outside world. The telegraph in front of Nell went silent. The lights in the saloon flickered and died. The entire town was cut off, an island of sudden darkness and confusion. The chaos was the opening Miguel had been waiting for. Though suspended, he was still the sheriff in his own mind. He had come to town as soon as he heard of Taza's capture, anticipating the worst. In the confusion of the power cut, he moved through the scattering crowd, a knife appearing in his hand. He cut the ropes binding Taza to the post.
"Go," he hissed, "through the alley. I will hold them off."
But their luck had run out. A man, a livery stable owner who had offered them a sympathetic word only days before, had seen the reward poster. The sum was more money than he had ever seen in his life. He had sent his son on a fast horse to find Vance Crow. As Taza, Nell, and Miguel ran down the dark alley, Crow and two of his own men stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. "The price on your heads just went up," Crow said, his voice flat. The fight was a desperate, swirling brawl in the narrow space. Miguel went down, a cry of pain escaping his lips as one of Crow's men shot him in the leg. Nell felt a searing pain in her shoulder as another man grabbed for her satchel, his fingernails tearing through her dress and into her skin. Taza moved with lethal grace. He disarmed one man and knocked the other unconscious against the brick wall. He stood panting, facing Crow, who held a gun on him. The stolen surveyor's map and Nell's duplicate ledger were in a pouch on his belt. The proof, the key to everything. He looked from Crow to Miguel, who was trying to staunch the flow of blood from his leg. He looked at Nell, her face pale with pain, clutching her bleeding shoulder. He had a choice that lasted only a heartbeat but defined the man he was. He could run, he could take the evidence and save himself, save the mission, or he could save his friend. Without a word, he unbuckled the leather pouch and tossed it to Nell. Then he turned, lifted Miguel in his arms, and charged back the way they had come, toward the far end of the alley. Crow, stunned by the unexpected move, was a second too slow to react. Taza disappeared with the wounded sheriff into the darkness, leaving Nell alone with the evidence, the weight of their entire struggle now resting on her injured shoulders. Later, from a safe distance, she looked back at Jericho Bend. The mob, cheated of its prey, had dispersed, leaving only a grim souvenir of their fury. The rope still hung from the awning's crossbeam, its empty noose swaying gently in the evening breeze, a silent, ghostly promise of a justice that had not been delivered, only delayed, and the price of that delay had been paid in their friend's blood. The escape from Jericho Bend was a blur of darkness and desperation. Taza, carrying Miguel's dead weight, moved with a speed that seemed impossible, melting into the familiar landscape of ravines and gullies. Nell followed, clutching the precious leather pouch, the pain in her shoulder a searing fire that kept her focused. They did not stop until the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. Taza finally laid Miguel down in the shelter of an overhanging ledge. The sheriff was pale and his breathing was shallow, the makeshift bandage on his legs soaked through with blood. "We cannot fix this," Nell said, her voice a raw whisper. "He needs a real doctor." Taza shook his head. "A doctor would report him. There is only one person I trust." He left her with the wounded sheriff and disappeared into the rocks. Nell, alone with the unconscious Miguel, felt a profound and terrifying isolation. She was a woman from Boston, a creature of paper and ink, now a fugitive in a vast, empty wilderness, responsible for a dying man and a collection of secrets that could get them all killed. She tore a strip from her petticoat and did her best to clean and rebind Miguel's wound, her movements clumsy but determined. Taza returned with the dawn, and he was not alone. Old Ada was with him, her ancient face impassive, her dark eyes missing nothing. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, carrying a leather bag that smelled of dried herbs and the earth itself. She knelt beside Miguel, her gnarled fingers probing the wound with a surprising gentleness. She worked in silence, applying a poultice of crushed leaves that smelled sharp and clean, then binding the leg with fresh cloth. "He will live," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "But he must be taken to a place of safety to heal. My people will watch over him." She then turned her sharp eyes on Nell. "And you are hurt." Before Nell could protest, the old woman was examining her shoulder. The scratches were deep and inflamed. Ada cleaned the wound with the same methodical care, applying a different, cooler balm that immediately soothed the burning pain. She gave Nell a small bundle of dried leaves. "Chew these if the pain returns," she instructed. "Your path is not finished." Arrangements were made in a series of low tones and silent gestures. Two of Ada's kinsmen appeared as if from the very rocks, and together they fashioned a litter for Miguel. They carried him away, disappearing into the folds of the land as silently as they had arrived. "Now," Ada said, turning to Taza and Nell, "you must disappear. There is a place, a box canyon, 3 miles north. The storm that comes will wash away your tracks. Go. Wait there." The sky had turned a bruised slate gray, and a cold wind was beginning to whip through the canyons. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall as they found the narrow entrance to the canyon Ada had described. It was a perfect hiding place, a deep scar in the earth with sheer rock walls and a sandy floor dotted with hardy sagebrush. The rain quickly became a downpour, a relentless, chilling sheet of water that soaked them to the bone in minutes. They found a shallow overhang, barely deep enough to offer any real protection, and huddled together against the cold stone. The world outside dissolved into a gray, watery curtain. When the rain finally subsided hours later, the air was sharp and cold. A damp chill had settled deep into their bones. Taza, his face grim, set about gathering the driest pieces of wood he could find. He worked with a patient, focused energy, and soon had a small, sputtering fire coaxed to life. It was a pitiful flame, hissing and smoking, but it was a center of warmth in the vast, cold emptiness. Nell shivered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. The pain in her shoulder had returned as a dull, persistent ache. Taza took off his heavy wool jacket, the only truly dry thing he possessed, and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of his body still clung to the fabric. It was an act of such simple, profound kindness that it almost broke her. She watched him as he moved about their small camp. He found a large, flat slab of sandstone and, with a grunt of effort, lifted and positioned it to block the worst of the wind, creating a more effective shelter around their small fire. He moved with a quiet competence, a strength that was part of the landscape itself. She thought of the men she had known in Boston, men who conducted business in fine suits, whose strength was measured in dollars and influence. They were powerful men, but their power was an abstract thing. Taza's strength was real, tangible. She had seen it when he carried Miguel, when he fought in the alley, when he stood on that crumbling bridge and chose mercy over vengeance. "I am afraid," she confessed, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. The words seemed to come of their own volition, rising from a place of deep exhaustion and fear. Taza stopped what he was doing and looked at her. His dark eyes were soft in the firelight. She pulled the jacket tighter around herself. "I am afraid that I am not strong enough for this. For this land, I came here thinking I could make a difference, that I could expose the truth with my words. But all I have done is bring pain and danger to the people I was trying to help. Miguel is wounded because of me. You were almost killed because of me. This is not your fault. Nell, this is Burke's doing. You only brought the light. He brought the violence. But what if the light is not enough, she whispered. What if I am not enough? Taza sat down across the small fire from her. He stared into the flames for a long moment before he spoke, his voice low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. I am also afraid, he said. The admission was so unexpected that it silenced her. Taza, the stoic warrior, the man who had faced down death without a flicker of fear, was afraid. I am afraid, he continued, that I am not gentle enough for a home. My whole life, I have been a fighter. It is all I have known. How to survive, how to protect, how to be hard enough that the world cannot break you. The white men see me and they see a savage. Even some of my own people see a warrior who has forgotten the ways of peace. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. These hands know how to hold a knife, how to guide a horse, how to fight. I do not know if they remember how to build, how to be still. His vulnerability was a raw, open wound, and it touched a place deep inside her that had been closed off since her husband's death. She saw past the warrior, past the silent Apache guide, and saw the man, a man as lonely and as lost as she was. She got up and walked around the fire. She stood beside him for a moment, then knelt in the sand. He was still looking at his hands. She reached out, her own hand trembling slightly, and laid it gently on his arm. His muscles tensed at her touch, then slowly relaxed. The warmth of his skin was a shock, a jolt of life. He turned his head and looked at her, his eyes full of a profound and weary sadness. "You're so strong," she whispered. The words were an echo of her thoughts, a truth that had settled in her soul. It was in that moment that the space between them collapsed, the silence filled with an unspoken understanding that was more powerful than any words. He raised his hand and gently touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized she had shed. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not born of passion, but of a desperate, shared need for comfort, for connection. It was hesitant at first, then deepened into a moment of pure, reckless tenderness. It was the warmth of the fire, the shelter of the rock, the feeling of not being alone in the vast, cold darkness. It was a man and a woman, stripped of everything but their shared humanity, finding a moment of grace in a world that had offered them none. They held the embrace for a long, quiet moment. Two solitary souls clinging to each other, a brief and beautiful respite from the storm. Then, as if by a silent, mutual agreement, they drew apart. There was no awkwardness, no regret. The boundary of respect between them had been maintained, the moment a perfect, self-contained thing. A deeper trust had been forged between them, a bond that went beyond their shared danger. Nell gave a small, shaky laugh, the sound a fragile thing in the quiet canyon. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Do not tell Maria," she said, a hint of her old wit returning. "She will make me bake 10 pies to atone for such scandalous behavior." For the first time since she had met him, Taza smiled. It was not a wide grin, but a slow, quiet lifting of the corners of his mouth that transformed his face, chasing away the shadows and revealing a warmth she had only glimpsed before. "Our secret," he said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the small fire a beacon of hope between them. The intimacy of the moment had not erased their danger, but it had changed its nature. They were no longer just allies. They were partners. "The judge in Tucson," Nell said, her voice clear and resolved. "That is our next move. My message to San Francisco was a precaution. We cannot wait for newspapers to act. We have to do this ourselves." Taza nodded, his expression serious once more. "We cannot go alone. Burke will have every road watched, and a judge will not act on the word of 2 fugitives and a piece of paper. He will need more. He will need living witnesses," she finished, understanding immediately. "Lee Wei, the ranchers who were forced off their land. And my people," Taza added. "A representative for the Ende. to speak of the theft of our sacred water. We will gather them. We will travel together, not as fugitives in the shadows, but as citizens seeking justice in the light. It was a new commitment, forged in the quiet of the canyon. They would no longer run. They would march on the heart of the territory's power, armed not just with their evidence, but with a coalition of the wronged. The small flame of their fire seemed to burn a little brighter, a tiny spark of defiance against the encroaching darkness. The quiet of the Box Canyon was a fragile piece, a stolen moment in time. They left it as the first rays of sun painted the canyon rim, not as fugitives, but as messengers with a purpose. The intimacy they had shared was not a distraction, but a crucible, forging their separate missions into a single, unbreakable resolve. They separated at the mouth of the canyon, a silent nod passing between them, a promise to meet again when the pieces of their desperate plan were in place. Nell rode back toward the hidden corners of the Ortega Ranch, her mind a flurry of codes and logistics. Maria met her not with questions, but with a fierce, protective embrace. Miguel was recovering in a small, hidden room, his leg propped up, his face pale but his eyes burning with a cold, steady anger. He had been stripped of his badge, but not of his authority. "We must gather the others," Maria said, her hands busy kneading dough. The simple, domestic act a stark contrast to the revolutionary words she spoke. The ranchers Burke has cheated. They are scared, but they are also angry. Anger can be a sharper tool than fear, if wielded correctly. Over the next 3 days, Maria's kitchen once again became the heart of the resistance. One by one, in the dead of night, the ranchers came. They were hard, sun-beaten men and women who had been pushed to the brink. Maria let them speak their piece, letting their grievances fill the small room. She did not offer them false hope or easy promises. She offered them a chance, a single, desperate chance, to reclaim what was theirs. She spoke of the stolen map, of Nell's ledger, and of the judge in Tucson. She laid out the truth, and then she laid out the risk. Some refused, their fear too deep, but enough of them, their faces grim and set, agreed to stand as witnesses. They were a small, defiant army bound by a shared enemy. Meanwhile, Taza journeyed deep into the Ende lands, guided by a silent understanding with old Ada. She had convened a council of elders, men with faces like ancient rock, who had seen treaties made and broken, who had learned to trust nothing but the land itself. Taza did not speak of laws or judges. He unrolled the surveyor's map and laid it on a stretched deer hide in the center of their circle. He spoke of the red line that cut through their sacred valley, the line that bled the life from Hidden Spring. He spoke of the iron serpent that would poison their water and drive away the game. He spoke not for himself, but for the future of their children. Old Ada, her voice a powerful, reedy instrument, spoke after him. "For too long, we have fought among ourselves while the true enemy grows stronger. This is not a white man's fight or an Apache's fight. It is a fight for the water. It is a fight for the earth that gives us all life. We will send 2 of our most respected leaders to speak. We will not offer violence, but we will not be silent. A temporary peace for a permanent future." Li Wei, his leg now strong enough for him to walk with a slight limp, had found his own way to contribute. He had connections among the other Chinese railroad workers, a silent, invisible network of men who saw and heard everything. He returned to their secret meeting place one evening, his face tired but his eyes bright with success. He laid a carefully copied timetable on the table. "Colonel Burke travels to Tucson in 2 days," he announced. "He rides in his private command car, attached to the morning supply train. This schedule tells us his exact route and timing." He paused, a wry, humorless smile touching his lips. "I can make the car stop. There are ways, but I must tell you, this kind of tea has a very bitter taste." With all the pieces in place, they gathered one last time. A strange and diverse coalition united by a single purpose. Miguel, propped up with pillows, was their legal strategist. Nell was their archivist, her duplicate ledger and handwritten transcriptions of coded telegrams the core of their evidence. Taza was their tactical expert, his knowledge of the land their greatest weapon. The plan was audacious. They would not go to Tucson. They would bring Tucson to them. Miguel had sent a trusted messenger, a young vaquero who could ride like the wind, with a secret letter to Judge Alistair Blackwood, a man known for his fierce independence and his dislike of the railroad's unchecked power. The letter did not ask for a verdict. It asked only that he bear witness. It gave him a time and a place, Rattler Ridge. 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 days hence. Rattler Ridge was a treacherous pass where the railroad tracks clung to a narrow ledge cut into the side of a mountain. On one side was a sheer cliff face. On the other, a 1,000-foot drop into the canyon below. It was a natural choke point. "We do not derail the train," Taza said, his voice firm. "There are innocent men on that engine. We stop it, that is all." Li Wei explained how a carefully placed log on the tracks, combined with a handful of caltrops of his own design to discourage any guards from advancing on foot, could bring the train to a halt without causing a catastrophe. The farmers would be hidden on the ridge above, silent witnesses. The Apache elders would be with them, their very presence a powerful testimony. Nell held up her sheaf of papers. "This is our most dangerous weapon. These are copies of the telegrams Burke sent, authorizing payments, ordering his men to secure land by any means necessary. In a court of law, he would deny them, but I have transcribed them in the railroad's own internal code. When I read them aloud, he will know that I know. We need him to react, to acknowledge them in front of the judge." The danger was a cold, unspoken presence in the room. They all knew what would happen if their plan failed. For Nell, it would be a charge of treason against the United States for interfering with the railroad. For Taza, the rope that had waited for him in Jericho Bend would finally find its purpose. For Miguel, it would mean the permanent loss of his position, a lifetime of service ending in disgrace. Before they left, Taza found Nell as she was checking the straps on her saddle. He stood before her for a moment in the pre-dawn gloom, the weight of the coming confrontation settling over them. "I am afraid," he said, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "Not of the fight. I am afraid of what it will unleash. If a single shot is fired, if blood is shed, then everything we are trying to build turns to ash. It becomes just another cycle of revenge." He gently took her hand, his touch a reassurance. "I have made a vow. We will not be the first to raise a weapon. We will not kill." She squeezed his hand, her own resolve hardening. "We will show them that justice does not have to come from the barrel of a gun." As they rode toward Rattler Ridge, the first distant cry of the train's whistle echoed through the canyons. It was a lonely, mournful sound, the iron voice of the civilization that was relentlessly grinding its way across the land. It was the sound of Burke's power, a promise of progress that had crushed the voices of so many. Today, they would make those voices heard. The air grew tense. The sun climbed higher. The final hour was approaching. The air on Rattler Ridge was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. Below, the canyon floor was a dizzying tapestry of shadow and light. Taza and Nell lay flat behind a jumble of rocks, watching the twin steel rails of the track glitter in the morning sun. 100 yards down the line, Li Wei and 2 of the sturdiest ranchers crouched beside a massive pine log, their hands on smaller poles, ready to lever it into place. Across the tracks, hidden in a shallow depression, were the homemade caltrops, their sharpened points glinting dully. High above them, scattered among the scree and juniper, the other witnesses were hidden, silent figures waiting for their moment. Nell could feel the vibration through the rock before she could hear the train. It was a low, deep hum that grew steadily into a rhythmic clatter. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the steady beat of the approaching engine. Beside her, Taza was unnaturally still, his focus absolute, his gaze fixed on the sharp bend in the track. He had kept his vow. They had brought no guns, only his knife, their courage, and the heavy weight of the truth. Then the train appeared, the black engine, belching a plume of thick smoke, rounded the curve, its great wheels churning. It was a creature of iron and steam, a symbol of the relentless force they had come to confront. Behind it were 3 supply cars. And then, at the very end, the opulent private car of Colonel Silas Burke, its polished wood and brass fittings a vulgar display of wealth and power against the rugged landscape. "Now," Taza said, his voice a low command that cut through the growing noise. At his signal, Leeway and the ranchers put their shoulders into the poles. The heavy logs shifted, hesitated, then rolled with a ponderous groan down the slight embankment, coming to rest squarely across both rails. It was a solid, undeniable barrier. The engineer in the locomotive saw it at the last second. The train's whistle shrieked, a piercing scream of tortured metal that echoed off the canyon walls. Brakes bit into the wheels, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The train shuddered, its cars lurching and clanging together as it slowed with agonizing slowness. It finally came to a complete stop, not 30 feet from the log, the engine hissing like a great, wounded beast. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the panting of the steam engine. Then, the door of the private car was thrown open and Colonel Burke stepped out onto the narrow platform. He was a tall, imposing man in a tailored suit, his face a mask of cold fury. He was followed by 2 armed guards and, a step behind them, Vance Crowe.
What is the meaning of this?
Burke bellowed, his voice accustomed to absolute obedience. Taza and Nell rose from behind the rocks and stepped into the open.
This is a legal proceeding. Colonel,
Nell called out, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the still mountain air. Burke's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto her, then shifting to Taza. A flicker of disbelief, then pure, unadulterated rage crossed his features. He saw the log, the 2 of them standing alone, and he saw it as an act of pathetic, amateur defiance.
A proceeding,
he sneered.
You are fugitives and criminals.
He turned to Crowe.
Take them.
But as Crowe and the guards started to move forward, Taza raised his hand and pointed to a high ledge across the canyon. 2 figures on horseback were now visible, silhouetted against the sky. Even at this distance, one was recognizable by his black judicial robes, Judge Alistair Blackwood and the town pastor. A man of unimpeachable moral character, sat their horses silent observers. Burke froze. This changed everything. This was not a backwoods ambush. It was a public tribunal. Nell stepped forward, the sheaf of papers in her hand. You are accused, Colonel Burke, of conspiracy, fraud, and incitement to violence in the acquisition of land and water rights in this territory.
This is an outrage,
Burke sputtered.
You have no proof.
I have your own words, Colonel, Nell replied, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. She began to read, not just the words, but the telegraphic codes that preceded them. Signal 7-2, authorizing payment to a Mr. Vance Crowe for the retrieval of private documents from E. Hart. Signal 4-9, authorizing a bonus for the foreman at San Pedro Gulch for services rendered. Dated the morning after the fire. Signal 1-6 to all SB Company surveyors. New route directive. Priority Alpha. Proceed through Nday Valley. Disregard federal treaty markers. She continued, her voice relentless, weaving a story of corruption with the railroad's own secret language. With each coded signal she read, another layer of Burke's carefully constructed facade was stripped away. His face went from red to a pasty white. This was impossible. She was reciting his most private and damning communications verbatim. He was not being accused. He was being dissected in front of a federal judge. He made his decision in a heartbeat. The law had failed him. So he would resort to his own. He smoothly drew a small, silver-plated pistol from inside his coat and aimed it directly at Nell.
The trial is over,
he said, his voice a low snarl. Time seemed to slow. One of the guards, loyal to his paymaster, raised his own rifle. Taza tensed, ready to move, knowing he would be too late. Vance Crowe had not moved. He stood a few feet to Burke's side, his face a blank mask. His eyes met Taza's across the short distance. In that instant, he saw not an enemy, but the man who had pulled him back from the edge of a cliff, the man who had offered him a justice he did not deserve. He saw the choice he had been running from his entire life. As Burke's finger tightened on the trigger, Vance moved. It was not a heroic dive, but a swift, economical act of violence. He pivoted and slammed his own pistol down on Burke's wrist. The shot went wide, a harmless crack that echoed into the canyon. At the same instant, the second guard fired his rifle. The bullet meant for Taza instead, tearing through the fleshy part of Vance's shoulder. Crowe grunted in pain, but did not fall. The chaos of the moment was all the opening Taza needed. He moved like a striking snake, covering the distance in 2 long strides. He did not go for a weapon. He grabbed the rifle from the shocked guard's hands and tossed it away, then spun, his forearm catching Burke across the jaw. The colonel crumpled to the ground, dazed. Taza did not pause. He pulled the leather reins from a nearby horse, and with a few swift, practiced motions, bound Burke's hands securely behind his back. He stood over the fallen railroad baron, breathing heavily, his vow unbroken. No one had been killed. The confrontation was not over. As the judge and the pastor began to make their way down a narrow trail, Li Wei appeared, dragging a heavy wooden shipping crate. He pried the lid open with a crowbar. Inside were stacks of ledgers and pay stubs. Work logs from the San Pedro Depot, he said, his voice loud and clear. For every man paid a bonus for special duties, each one initialed by the same man. He held up a log. The initials were a bold, arrogant SB. Then, from the rocks above, the Apache elders emerged, followed by the silent, grim-faced ranchers. They were no longer hiding. They were a delegation of the dispossessed. Old Ada, her face a mask of ancient authority, walked to the front. She did not speak. She simply pointed a long, bony finger at the surveyor's map that Taza now held open. Her finger traced the red line that desecrated Hidden Spring. Her silent accusation was more powerful than any shouted word. Nell looked at the assembly. The judge, the railroad men, the ranchers, the Chinese worker, the Apache elders, all of them, brought together by one man's greed. She stepped forward, her voice filled with a passion that came from the very core of her being. "Nothing and no one truly belongs to another," she said, her words a quiet sermon on the mountainside. "Not this land, not the water, and not the people. They can only be stewarded, and that must be done with fairness for all." Judge Blackwood finally reached them. He was a tall, stern man with eyes that seemed to see right through to a man's soul. He surveyed the scene Burke tied on the ground, Vance clutching his bleeding shoulder, the crate of ledgers, the map, and the silent ring of witnesses. He bent down and picked up Nell's ledger. He looked at her handwritten transcriptions of the telegrams. He straightened up and looked at the stunned engine crew. "Take this man," he said, his voice the very embodiment of the law, pointing at Burke. "Confine him to his car. He is under arrest by the authority of the United States Territorial Court." He then took a heavy wax seal and his official stamp from his coat pocket and pressed it onto the cover of Nell's ledger, officially taking it as evidence. "Your testimony," he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group, "will be heard." As the train's crew, their faces a mixture of fear and awe, hauled the sputtering, defeated Colonel Burke to his feet and marched him back to his car, a profound silence fell over Rattler Ridge. The engineer, following an unspoken command, released the last of the pressure from his engine. The final, great hiss of steam faded away, leaving only the sound of the wind whispering through the pines. For the first time, the machine was quiet, and the voices of the people, for now, had won. The journey to Tucson was a surreal inversion of their flight into the wilderness. Colonel Burke was a prisoner in his own luxurious rail car, the velvet seats and polished brass, a mocking cage of his own making. In the rattling, drafty supply car ahead, his accusers rode in a strange and solemn procession. Nell sat on a wooden crate, her ledger wrapped in oilcloth and resting on her lap, a testament to the power of a single, stubborn voice. Taza stood by the open door, watching the familiar landscape roll by, his expression unreadable. Vance Crowe, his shoulder bandaged by the pastor who had accompanied the judge, sat in a corner, his gaze fixed on the floor, a man adrift between his past and an uncertain future. The ranchers and the Apache elders were quiet, their presence a silent, powerful jury. The legal proceedings in Tucson were swift and decisive. Judge Alistair Blackwood was not a man who tolerated corruption, and the evidence laid before him was a mountain so vast it blotted out any shadow of a doubt. Nell's ledger, the coded telegrams, the stolen map, the work logs provided by Lee Way, and the quiet, damning testimony of the ranchers and the Ende elders all painted a single, irrefutable picture. The Silas Burke Company's exclusive charter for the territory was summarily revoked. A full federal investigation was launched into every land deal, every contract, every suspicious fire that had occurred since the railroad had laid its first track, and a territorial marshal was dispatched with a new, official order, reinstating Miguel Ortega as the lawful sheriff of Jericho Bend County, effective immediately. Burke himself was held in federal custody, his empire of lies crumbling into the same red dust he had sought to conquer. Vance Crowe's fate was decided not in a grand courtroom, but in the quiet, dusty office of the newly returned Sheriff Ortega. Miguel sat behind his desk, his bandaged leg propped on a stool, his badge once again pinned to his vest. Vance gave his statement without hesitation, a flat, factual accounting of his work for Burke, omitting nothing, offering no excuses. When he was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. "You will stand trial," Miguel said, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a weary sense of duty. "But your testimony against Burke will be taken into account." Vance nodded, accepting his fate. Before they led him to a cell, he asked to speak with Taza, who had been waiting in the outer office. The two men stood for a moment, the space between them charged with the memory of their violent confrontations. "He offered me a clean slate," Vance said, his voice low. "I spent my whole life running from my past, thinking a clean slate was the same as a clear conscience. I was wrong." He looked at Taza, a grudging respect in his eyes. "I tried to kill you. You had every reason to leave me on that bridge, or to put a knife in me. Why did you not? Revenge does not heal the wound," Taza said simply. "It only makes it deeper." Vance considered this for a long moment. "You are strong because you know when to stop," he said finally. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. He turned and walked to his cell without looking back. The healing of the community began not with a treaty or a document, but with the building of a water trough. It was a simple, practical thing, constructed at the edge of town near the trail that led to Hidden Spring. The lumber was donated by a rancher who had gotten his land back. The labor was provided by a mix of townsfolk, railroad workers, and several of the younger Apache men. It was a slow, sometimes awkward process, a first tentative step across a chasm of mistrust. When it was finished, they held a gathering that was not a celebration, but a council. They stood around the new trough, the scent of fresh-cut pine sharp in the air. Old Ada was there, representing the Ende. Lee Way stood with a small group of his fellow workers. Even Zebulon, the store owner who had led the mob against Miguel, was present, his face humbled and his demeanor quiet. They did not talk of the past. They talked of the future. They talked of fair access to the water, of grazing rights, of mutual respect. They agreed to form a water council, with a representative from each group, to settle disputes and manage the precious resource for the good of all. It was a fragile beginning, a promise whispered in the vast silence of the West. "Taza, Using a sharpened piece of iron heated in a fire, carved 3 words into the side of the trough, one below the other. The first was in the Apache language for water, the second was the Spanish word, agua, and the third was the English word, water, 3 languages, 1 life source. Nell found her own healing in the familiar click and clack of the telegraph key. She sat in the Jericho Bend office, the place where her long journey had begun, and began to write. But these were not the frantic, secret dispatches of a woman seeking vengeance. These were calm, measured stories, filled not with heroes and villains, but with the quiet dignity of ordinary people. She wrote of the ranchers' long struggle, of the silent contributions of the Chinese workers, of the deep connection the Ende had to the land. Her first article, sent to a dozen newspapers across the country, did not begin with an account of the dramatic showdown at Rattler Ridge. It began with a simple, declarative sentence: the West does not need new heroes, only honest hearts. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of glory, Taza walked alone to a low and flat-topped mesa that overlooked the valley. It was a place his people had used for generations for quiet contemplation. He built a small fire of sage and mesquite, a fire that gave off heat and a fragrant scent, but almost no smoke. He was not praying for victory. He was giving thanks that the victory had not come at the cost of more lives. He sat before the small fire for a long time, a solitary figure communing with the spirits of his ancestors, his heart finally at peace. He had not reclaimed what was lost, but he had helped to build something new, something that his family's honor could rest upon. Back at the Ortega Ranch, the sounds of life had returned. The kitchen was once again filled with the smell of Maria's cooking and the low murmur of conversation. Nell was helping her shell peas, her hands moving with a newfound sense of peace. Taza entered, the scent of sage smoke still clinging to him, and sat at the table. He and Nell exchanged a look, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had been through. A look that held the memory of a shared fire in a cold canyon. Maria, her eyes twinkling with mischief, broke the silence. You had better marry him soon. Eleanor, she said, nudging Nell with her elbow. If you do not, one of those wealthy ranch widows from the north will surely snatch him up. A man who can fight like a demon and build like a saint is a rare commodity in this territory. Nell felt a hot blush creep up her neck, and she suddenly found the peas in her bowl to be the most fascinating things in the world. Taza, for his part, did not look away or offer a gruff denial. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that reached all the way to his eyes. It was a very Apache smile, quiet, knowing, and full of a promise that needed no words. The months that followed the trial did not bring an easy peace, but a quiet, industrious one. The West did not change its nature overnight. The sun was still blistering, the winters still cold, and the land was still hard. But the people, the fragile human element scattered across its vastness, had begun to change. The shadows of prejudice and fear had not vanished, but they had receded, making way for a tentative, hopeful light. Taza did not return to the solitary life of a horse guide. On a piece of land granted to him by the new Water Council, nestled in a valley that was now a shared resource, he started to build, with the help of the ranchers he had defended. He erected a series of sturdy corrals and a long, low barn. He began a horse training operation, but his methods were unlike any the local settlers had seen. He used no harsh bits, no breaking of a horse's spirit. He used patience and a deep, intuitive understanding, a language of trust that the animals seemed to grasp immediately. His reputation for gentling the most difficult horses spread, and his business thrived. But the most important work happened on the weekends, in a small, single-room schoolhouse he built with his own hands. He and Nell held classes on Saturdays and Sundays. The children of the ranchers and the children of the Ende sat side by side on rough-hewn benches, learning to read from the same books and write on the same slates. It was a small, radical act of hope, a place where the next generation could learn a different language than the one of hatred their parents had known. Nell, for her part, did not return to Boston. Jericho Bend had become her home. She took over a small, abandoned storefront on the main street and transformed it. The front half became the new telegraph office. Its wires no longer a tool for corporate greed, but a lifeline connecting their small community to the wider world. The back half of the room, however, was her true passion. It was a community reading room, its shelves lined with books and newspapers she had ordered from the East. It was a quiet, sunlit space where anyone could come to read, to learn, to engage with the world beyond the dusty horizon. She was no longer just a telegraph operator or a reporter. She was a keeper of words, a cultivator of understanding. One warm evening in late autumn, the extended family they had forged through fire and fear gathered on the long porch of the Ortega Ranch. The air was filled with the comfortable sounds of their new reality. Miguel, his leg now healed though he walked with a slight, dignified limp, raised a glass of cider in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And to the friends who show us that justice is not a thing you are given, but a thing you build together." Lee Wei, now the respected foreman of a new, independent freight company, was teaching Maria's 2 young sons the intricate art of pulling noodles by hand. He laughed, a rare, full-bodied sound, as one of the boys ended up with a tangle of dough wrapped around his head. Even old Ada, who had come down from the mountains for the gathering, let out a dry, raspy chuckle, a sound like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. The sound of children's laughter drifted over from the newly painted water trough, where a group of Apache and settler children were splashing in the cool water, their languages mingling in a happy, unintelligible babble. Later, after the others had gone inside and a blanket of stars had been thrown across the immense, dark sky, Nell and Taza sat together on the edge of the porch. A comfortable silence stretched between them. A silence built of shared memories and a deep, unspoken trust. The moon was a silver crescent, its pale light just enough to illuminate the landscape, softening its harsh edges. Nell leaned her head against his shoulder. The rough wool of his shirt was a familiar, comforting texture. She thought of that night in the box canyon, of the fear and the cold, and the tiny spark of hope they had kindled between them. They had come so far. Strength is not just in your hands. "Taza," she whispered, her voice a soft murmur in the vast quiet. Her words were a gentle echo, a quiet answer to his confession from that night. "It is in how you hold the peace." He did not answer with words. He simply relaxed into her touch, a slow, complete release of the tension he had carried for a lifetime. He was no longer just a warrior, a protector, a survivor. He was a builder, a teacher, a man at peace in his own skin, in his own home. Their love was like the landscape around them, not easy or gentle, but vast, durable, and breathtakingly real. It was not a love of grand passions and flowery words, but a love of daily care, of shared responsibility, of looking in the same direction toward a future they were building with their own hands. Across the country, the ripples of their victory were spreading. Nell's articles, printed in newspapers in St. Louis, Chicago, and even Boston, had started a national conversation. People were beginning to question the unchecked power of the great railroad companies, to wonder about the true cost of the manifest destiny they had always been told was a glorious thing. A seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to grow. The West was still the West. It promised no easy comfort, no guarantee of safety. But as they sat there, watching the silver moonlight reflect off the freshly painted letters on the community water trough, they knew they had changed their small corner of it. They had drawn a new map, not with lines of conquest, but with threads of connection. The land did not promise peace, but they had promised themselves and each other that they would make it more just. One bucket of water, one written word, one hoofbeat at a time. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help it reach more people.